World War I is the most important event of the 20th century, and why? Imagine you are an emerging world power at the turn of the 19th century. Imagine you formed yourself from the shattered remains of the Holy Roman Empire, composed of more than 1,000 entities, leaving behind a patchwork of kingdoms. Then, this guy Napoleon tries to invade the mess. No, not that Napoleon. It was actually his nephew, knockoff Napoleon. Although the OG Napoleon did attack them too in the early 1800s.
Now, like Napoleon, I will divide and conquer.
So, the kingdoms joined forces in a unified coalition to decisively spank the great value Napoleon in the largest European land battle of the 19th century. And not just spank him, you kick his ass so hard that his entire government collapses and he gets locked on an island. And with the resultant surge of nationalism that comes on the heels of that victory, the seeds of unification are sown. Fast forward through a half century of false starts, revolutions, and uprisings, and you finally declare yourself a country in 1877. You are now Germany. You find yourself in a world where a small area of Western Europe has pretty much managed to colonize the entire world. Despite your earlier skirmish with France, everything seems cordial now. Everyone has their territories, and business is booming. It would seem absolutely ludicrous to suggest that these world powers would soon go to war. And not just a proxy war. They were not going to make poorer countries fight each other. No, they would all duke it out on their home continent. And it would be this war that would cause the collapse of all the remaining European monarchies: Russia, Austro-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. The irony of this situation should not be lost on anyone.
Stop! What do you command?
It's just good business.
When you look at why the war started in the first place, it really was a cascade of unforced errors due to poor leadership. The fatal flaw of monarchies is that they aren't meritocratic. Even if a leader is a brilliant tactician, there is no guarantee that their kid won't be dumb as rocks. It is definitely not a coincidence that World War I occurred from a number of monarchs of questionable intelligence all existing in tandem, whose collective dumbassery compounded into this shitstorm. In retrospect, it is astonishing that the world powers more or less stumbled in to an event that ended so disastrously. It would be these wars that lead to the end of France and the UK as superpowers, lead to the rise of Hitler and Stalin, and divide up the Middle East along boundaries so flawed that there is still ethnic and religious conflict going on about it to this day. This brings me to a few World War I talking points I absolutely hate. First, that it was inevitable, or that the outcome was inevitable. Second, that the Germans were the bad guys just like in World War II. Although if you want to look like the good guy, I wouldn't recommend wearing spikes on your helmet. And lastly, that World War I was all trench warfare. All of these talking points are either blatantly untrue or gross oversimplifications. The fact of the matter is that one set of circumstances caused two world wars, yet the lead up to the second one is much, much more widely discussed. The purpose of this diatribe is an attempt to remedy that. To do this, I am going to be going over what I believe are the four primary things that coincided to cause this war. Number 1, bad leadership. Number 2, European expansionism. Number 3, interlocking alliance structures. And number 4, outdated assumptions about military tactics. But first, let's familiarize ourselves with the players. Chapter 1. The Empires. On the screen, you'll see some economic stats of the empires involved in the year 1900. We'll look at population size, GDP, and this middle column, which we have dubbed the power column. This stands for percentage of world economy ranked. Obviously, there are other factors that would contribute to an empire's power, but the portion of the world economy encompassed by all their territory is a pretty useful metric to understand the size and standings of our players. The empires on one side of the war are shown in green, the Allied powers. The ones in red are on the other side, the Central Powers. Now, please do not let your associations of green being good and red being bad allow you to draw a false equivalency to the sides in this war. There really isn't a good side and an evil side, just an incompetent side and a delusional side. Well, both sides are incompetent and delusional, but to different degrees. You know, I said this was a talking point that I really hate, so I might as well elaborate on it right now. Yes, the Germans were the bad guys in this war. They did bad things. Their motivations for war are not virtuous, but they're not so cartoonishly bad that all other blame can be swept under the rug, like World War II. World War I is much, much more complicated in who is to blame. You may also be wondering how it is that the United Kingdom has more people than China, despite being 1/39th the size. These population numbers are also counting the populations of all the territory colonized by the empires. For the UK, this notably includes India. Similarly, these columns also factor in the economic output of the empire's colonies. So, Germany just arose on the world stage 33 years ago, and they didn't really have much in the way of colonies. But you'll notice they're still pulling fourth in overall GDP and are only 10 million people shy of the entire French Empire, despite being contained in a much smaller area. Germany had very shortly become an economic powerhouse, with GDP higher than France and Russia. Contrast this with Germany's allies during the war, Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans, who were still languishing in the lower tier of all these areas and really didn't have much territory. This is the territorial map separated by the Allied powers in blue and the Central powers in orange. So let's talk a bit more about these subpar allies. Austro-Hungary was directly south of Germany and ruled by a monarch. The best way to understand Austro-Hungary is it was governed something like the EU. It was a diverse multi-ethnic state that spoke a lot of different languages, and for that reason they had a very hard time fighting cohesively. They were also mostly agrarian, with not much in the way of industry. But Austria was part of the German-speaking heartland of the Holy Roman Empire, so the two shared a lot of cultural ties, being basically brothers. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were another multi-ethnic land empire, also derived from Rome. Now, you may be wondering, how are the Ottomans derived from Rome? Well, Rome did not all collapse at the same time. The western portion of the empire collapsed first, and then the eastern portion limped on for quite a while and collapsed later, ultimately succumbing to plague and loss of territory. The Turkish sultans swooped in and installed themselves as the new legitimate Roman empires and established the Ottoman Empire. This Ottoman dynasty would last for 6 centuries before coming to an end in World War I. Prior to this, though, the Ottomans had become an empire in decline. In the late 18th century, they were described by Tsar Nicholas as the sick man of Europe. And when you're getting roasted by early 19th century Russia, you know things are definitely not good. The Ottoman Empire was basically borrowing huge sums of money to stay afloat before ultimately going bankrupt in 1875. They were being supported by the Brits to bolster against Russian influence in Eastern Europe. So, all in all, the Central Forces were not a strong force, with the exception of Germany. They're essentially reliant on the abilities of one star player to carry the entire team. This isn't like Michael Jordan and a bunch of Make-A-Wish kids, but think something like LeBron and the '08 Cavs. Germany's allies would consistently fuck up and get themselves into horrible military or financial positions that Germany would then have to bail them out of. This war was not really good for anyone. The only ones who ended off better off for it were the US and the Brits. What's interesting about this is that out of everyone, these were the two with the least stake in the conflict. They got more or less roped into it. For everyone else more directly involved, it was catastrophic. France's economy was tanked. Russia's was tanked. Germany was so effed up that we know what they went on to do. Russia was particularly pissed off since the war cost them a massive chunk of Eastern Europe: Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. This was absolutely devastating for them because these areas comprised 1/3 of their population, half of the industrial land, 90% of the coal fields, and 26% of the railways. The Soviet Union, of course, would later try to remedy this and then subsequently crack apart and lose Ukraine again, the effects of which are playing out right now. Chapter 2: The Alliances. Now, when I said that the primary cause of this war was interlocking alliances, you may have thought to yourself, well, isn't the cause of every war interlocking alliance structures? If a statement applies to every war in history, it's a pretty weak statement. Or maybe you didn't think that, but I'm going to respond to it anyway. First of all, there are wars where alliances play very little role, if any at all. Let's say you have two countries that decide to fight each other, but nobody really likes either of them or cares. Or maybe a country decides to invade another one because it's rich in resources, and the defending country has allies that may or may not come to its aid. Or maybe the war wasn't against people at all, but against huge birds. Anyway, alliances often do factor into the decisions to go to war, but they aren't always a primary cause. In World War I, the alliance structures were like an unstable molecule that undergoes a chemical chain reaction. The structures emboldened the countries involved and put them in a high-tension position where they were absolutely primed for something to happen. What I'm saying is that the alliance structures of World War I were uniquely contributory to it happening at all. So, what is the structure of this molecule? Remember, Germany really did not like France, and vice versa, due to France's attempts to take over Germany. Twice. First by Napoleon, and then again by Great Value Napoleon. German disdain for France was absolutely cooked into their national identity.
Identity theft is not a joke, Jim.
Now, the British and the French were historic rivals, but both were alarmed by Germany's rapid swell of military and economic power. The Germans had also tried to engage in a naval arms race, which they had lost to the UK. This led the UK to cozy up to France. It was like if the oldest crime families of New York decided to band together to fight the emergence of the new kids on the block who threatened to dismantle the established order. There was an agreement between the French and the British, l'entente cordiale, established in 1904. This resolved many of their petty colonial disputes and set the stage for greater cooperation. It's like how in The Godfather, when Don sits down with the other mob bosses and says, "Look, guys, we have to stop all this infighting because it's ultimately bad for business."
The banking clan will sign your treaty.
Russia concurred with this and signed Le Triple Entente in 1907, as they were very antsy about Germany's capabilities. The purpose here was containment. Despite Russia being an autocracy and France and Britain leading towards democratic governance, they set aside their differences. This was the final straw for the Ottomans. Remember, Britain had been supporting the Ottomans financially as a buffer against Russia prior to this, but they began withdrawing their support in the late 1800s. By the time of the war, Britain was doing jack shit for the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire interpreted this as a major threat and betrayal. So, the Ottomans were isolated and paranoid that Russia and the UK could now potentially collude and completely take them over. Hence, they began to cozy up to Germany, who could provide them with military and economic support. The Ottomans feared being carved up by the New World Order, which, in hindsight, is a relatively base take, given that's ultimately what happened. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungary is Germany's biggest trading partner, but Austro-Hungary, being a less advanced economy, makes it very dependent on Germany for pretty much everything. As for the others, Italy was pissed at France because they had lost territory to them in 1881. Somewhat like Germany, Italy had only been established 20 years before, in 1861, so they were new on the world stage and wanted a piece of the pie held by France and Britain. Italy would later flip-flop and join the Allied powers in exchange for land at the end of the war, because they were just two-faced snakes like that. Serbia and Bulgaria were neighbors with a contentious property dispute that I will not get into right now.
Don't worry, Balkans. You'll get your own chapter.
So, we have all these very deep-rooted nationalistic rivalries which cause all these empires to fall into this unstable structure. Once the fuse was lit and the gears of mobilization began to churn, there was absolutely nothing to stop them from fighting themselves into oblivion.
Chapter 3. Outdated Assumptions.
There had been about a century of relative peace prior to World War I. There was conflict, sure, but these were conflicts on the peripheries and largely not involving all the world powers. You could attribute this to a few things. By this point, everybody had pretty much stopped colonizing since the world was completely carved up. The Americas had declared independence and told Europe that if they came anywhere near North or South America, they'd have their asses handed to them. Great Britain settled into their role as world's hegemon and transitioned into acting as a global police force and policing trade routes. Tensions in Europe had largely died down, in part because of good, robust leadership. But there is an old belief that once a society becomes too distant from the trials of war, we collectively forget how truly terrible it is. Such a long period of peace allows for some odd sentiments to take root in a population. Sentiments like, war is a grand adventure, or dying for your country is always noble, regardless of the actual cause of the war. Similarly, when you have a political monarchy that becomes removed from being in a war by decades, it tends to stock its military with generals promoted on the basis of family lineage and status instead of merit. It's easy to see then how paradoxically a century of peace can create a lot of the conditions that lead to war. There had also been massive technological progress in weaponry during this time. So much of what was previously thought about how a war would be fought and won led to many, many outdated assumptions about how this war would be fought and won. A lot of these assumptions look pretty dumb when we look back on them. Yes, sending cavalry into machine guns and barbed wire won't work, even in a video game, and massed infantry charges are similarly ineffective. Other assumptions took a little bit longer to figure out. Throughout the war, people vastly overestimated the damage they could do through artillery, and we would see some of the most comically large artillery pieces ever produced during this time. The top brass took a few years to get it out of their heads that you could just shell an enemy position into oblivion, then shout Leroy Jenkins and send in the infantry. Some real tactics would actually be needed. You may recall me saying at the beginning that I do not like the talking point that World War I was all trench warfare. And yes, there was a lot of trench warfare. In terms of amount of artillery expended and deaths, you can make that case. But much of the trench warfare was pointless. In the 20th century, everyone now had machine guns and artillery that could blast out high explosive shells at a mean rate. So, in the trenches, progress was agonizingly slow. Things were at a stalemate, and something had to be done. Tanks were designed to solve the problem of actually getting to and over the enemy line. Could the Allies have won without tanks? Probably. Yes. However, their implementation was one of several deciding factors. The 100-day offensive at the end of World War I was a coordination of tanks, planes, artillery, and infantry that took the fight out of the trenches. The tanks weighed heavily on the morale of German soldiers and the top brass of the German military. This guy, Ludendorff, wrote a report to the Kaiser in which he enumerated the things that crumbled the army. The first he listed was the tank. It would be appropriate to say that winning World War I involved ending trench warfare, not winning it. Trench warfare cost huge amounts of soldiers their lives and resulted in taking little to no territory. If anything, World War I was about learning the lessons that trench warfare doesn't work, and then figuring out how to adjust tactics and technology accordingly. In addition to this, the entire war in the East was a war of mobility, not fought in the trenches. Anyway, there was an overwhelming belief at the time that the key to winning any war was being able to mobilize your troops fast and get to the battlefield first. For this reason, almost everybody had conscript armies. Men would have to join the military for 2 years at 18 and then be ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. For anyone in America, this would be like if every single young man was in the National Guard. At this time, defense spending averaged a whopping 5% of GDP. It's interesting then that the two countries least affected by the war, Britain and the United States, did not have conscript armies, but rather trained militaries. Now, before you go shitting yourself in the comments, yes, the UK and the United States use conscripts, but their army was not designed with conscripts in mind. They did not conscript every single 19-year-old. Once you get drafted, your training starts. Britain, of course, sank a lot of its defense spending into maintaining its extensive navy. This uniquely positioned them to be the ones who would ultimately invent tanks and end the stalemate. As it turned out, sending millions of troops with just a couple years combat training and telling them to duke it out in trenches with machine guns, grenades, and artillery did not, in fact, ensure quick victory.
Chapter 4. Bad Leadership.
Now, let's briefly return to the century of peace. The 1800s was absolutely the time of giants on the world stage. This was the age of empires and modernization. Here, we have Tsar Alexander II. Helming Russia, he eliminated serfdom, reformed the military, and increased the role of local government. But most importantly, he was dedicated to keeping Russia out of war. He knew that Russia was weak and needed to modernize and probably would not survive a war with a major power. Over in Germany, we have Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Just a side note, the Iron Chancellor has to be the coolest nickname of any world leader I have ever heard. Most of them are so lame. It's like Honest Abe, or Alexander the Great, or Ivan the Terrible. Fucking Iron Chancellor, let's go. He was the one to unite Germany as a country and defeat France, and was particularly concerned with ensuring the survival of this new German state. He made it his life's goal that France and Russia would never ally. He was also known to drink a whole bottle of champagne at breakfast and famously predicted that the Great European War would come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans. Oh my. Bismarck and Alexander were certainly not necessarily morally virtuous figures, but they were certainly capable statesmen who kept their countries moving in the right direction. Let's contrast these titans with those of the 1900s. This is Tsar Nicholas II. His entire administration was fraught with mismanagement. It was probably an omen that his coronation was marred with a pretzel fiasco that left, but Jesus fucking Christ, 1,200 people dead? This was the same sort of thing as people getting crushed on Black Friday, except they were trying to get pretzels and beer. Rumor got out that there wasn't going to be enough, and a stampede ensued. Anyway, Nicholas never really wanted to rule in the first place, but it was a monarchy, so he took up the mantle. He was a weak and indecisive leader. As World War I dragged on, the Russians kept being handed defeat after defeat, and he was ultimately removed from office after taking direct control of the military and failing. He went willingly, though, and was replaced by a provisional government who continued to fight on despite virtual universal hatred of the war by the Russian population. This ultimately led to the Russian Revolution and the collapse of its monarchy. Then, over in Germany, we had Wilhelm II. He fired Otto von Bismarck and decided to take Germany in a much more imperialist direction. It may not surprise you to hear that he was also a king. Yes, the King of Prussia before it united Germany. So, he takes the reins and proceeds to piss everyone off. He makes threats, he builds things in other people's territories, he alienates Britain by engaging in a naval arms race to challenge them at sea. He ends up in a position where he has pushed away all the allies that Bismarck built for him except for Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans. Wilhelm was also fond of the interesting practice of brinksmanship. Oh boy, I've had it with these guys. So, similar to Nicholas, by the end of the war, he had ruined his standing in the eyes of the military and the public and had to flee his country and go into exile. Finally, in Austro-Hungary, we had Franz Joseph I. He was 84 and mostly checked out. Franz had become increasingly withdrawn and emotionally distant as he got older. This isn't that surprising given his legitimately sad circumstances. His wife was assassinated, his brother was executed, his son killed himself, and his nephew got shot. Now, remember Franz's nephew as he will be very important later. As they say, the most dangerous man is one who has absolutely nothing to lose. He considered the military to be the most important pillar of the monarchy, but was described as being not blessed with any aptitude for strategy. It is not surprising then that this motley crew of insecure morons would be responsible for the beginning of the war. With that being said, the pieces are in place, the bomb has been planted, and all it will take is a spark.